The crown was already burning. Not with fire, with something older. It pressed against my temples like a second skull trying to fit inside the first one, and every pulse of its crystal matrix sent a wave of cold down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the chamber. 43 champions stood before me. 43. The greatest warriors of 43 species, each one chosen by their world's highest authority and delivered to my ritual chamber like carefully wrapped gifts. They gleamed. They towered. They radiated the specific, practiced energy of beings who had spent their entire lives being told they were exceptional. The Goral champion had 8 limbs, each ending in a blade ridge that caught the light of the chamber's bioluminescent columns. The Surath representative was so tall his head grazed the ceiling. The Drevani stood perfectly still, in the way only engineered soldiers could stand, not resting, not waiting, simply existing in a state of perpetual readiness that made the air around him feel tight. I looked at all of them. The crown looked at all of them. And then, one by one, like stars going out, it rejected every single one. The Goral champion first. The crown's hum dropped to a flat, toneless pulse. No, the Surath next. Same silence. The Drevani, the crystalline warrior from the Velorath system who had not lost a recorded combat in 11 years. The bound ones from the deep colonies, bred across generations specifically for moments like this one. No, 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 no. 43 rejections in 4 minutes. The Resonance Crown had operated continuously for 10,000 years of Velkoth sovereign rule. It contained the encoded memory of every empress and emperor who had ever worn it. It was, by every measure of science and history, incapable of error. I was going to have a very serious conversation with 10,000 years of accumulated imperial wisdom about what it thought it was doing. High Lord Verk stood to my left, his war mantle arranged in precise ceremonial folds, his expression arranged in something that was trying very hard not to be satisfaction. He had opposed the right from the beginning. He had argued, with the elegant condescension he had spent 40 years perfecting, that a sovereign who required a bound champion was already admitting weakness. I had overruled him. I was beginning to understand why he was almost smiling. The chamber was silent in the particular way that large rooms full of powerful beings go silent when something has gone catastrophically wrong in public. No one moved. No one breathed loudly. Everyone was watching me with the careful attention of people who were already composing their accounts of this moment for private transmission later. And then something moved behind the pressure glass wall. The service corridor that ran along the eastern side of the chamber was not supposed to be occupied during the rite. It was a maintenance passage, pipes, conduit lines, the kind of functional intestine that every grand building hides behind its ceremonial face. No one ever looked at it during important occasions. It was, by design, invisible. He was not supposed to be there. He was there anyway. He was walking at the specific pace of someone who had somewhere to be and was mildly irritated about how long it was taking to get there. He was holding something. It took me a moment to identify it as a ration pack from the prisoner processing level, the compressed gray kind we issued to captured combatants, the kind that every being who had ever eaten one described as tasting like regret pressed into a rectangle. He was eating it anyway. And he was talking. Not to anyone visible. To himself, apparently. His mouth was moving with the focused energy of someone conducting a very important internal debate out loud, pausing occasionally to gesture at the air with the ration pack, as though making a point his invisible conversation partner had failed to grasp. He was, I observed, in prisoner processing attire. He was human. His file, which my secondary cortex retrieved in the 3 seconds I spent staring at him through the pressure glass, read as follows: Cale Marin, age 28, USCF, former Border Combat Unit, Firebase Yuma, captured during the Selrath border skirmish, scheduled for standard processing. He had not looked at the ceremony once. He was completely unaware that 43 of the galaxy's most precisely cultivated warriors had just been evaluated and discarded 6 meters behind his left shoulder. The crown sang. It did not hum. It did not pulse. It sang, a high, clear, harmonic resonance that I had never felt from it before in 11 years of wearing it for practice ceremonies. It rang through my skull and down my jaw and into my teeth, and it felt, with a specificity that I found deeply inconvenient, like recognition. I stood very still. The Goral champion shifted his weight. The movement made his blade ridges catch the light and threw a brief shimmer across the pressure glass wall, and the human in the service corridor glanced sideways at the flash, saw the enormous ritual chamber full of alien warriors and one crowned empress all staring in his approximate direction, and stopped walking. He looked at his ration pack. He looked at us. He looked at his ration pack again. He kept walking. The crown sang louder. Empress? Verk's voice was exactly as quiet as it needed to be to reach me and no one else. The crown is responding. I am aware, I said. To the service corridor. I am aware, Verk. To the human in the service corridor. The calculus of command required me to respond with authority. It required a clean decision, delivered without hesitation, that would demonstrate to 43 alien champions and 12 high lords that the Resonance Crown's unprecedented behavior was entirely within my understanding and control. The rite is adjourned, I said. All champions will be housed and honored. We resume tomorrow. There was no tomorrow option in the ritual protocol. I had just invented it. No one said so out loud. I walked out of the chamber through the sovereign door and stood in the corridor beyond it for exactly 30 seconds, which was how long it took me to perform 17 distinct calculations about what had just happened and arrive at the same answer every single time. The crown had chosen. I had one night to find a reason it was wrong. I ran those calculations until the 3rd hour of the night cycle. 17 variations, 31 permutations of the base logic. I consulted the historical record of every Resonance Crown selection in 10,000 years of documented use. Not once in 10,000 years had it selected a prisoner. Not once had it selected a human. I was the first empress in recorded history to have the crown make an unambiguous selection, and then require an adjournment to sit alone in her private war chamber, running arithmetic at the walls. My mother would have found this very funny. She was Ash, so she was not available for consultation. By the 4th hour I had stopped running new calculations. I was running the same one, repeatedly, because the answer it kept returning was the one I did not want. The crown was not malfunctioning. It had selected the variable that, by every measure of its 10,000-year logic, returned the highest probability of imperial survival. A human, 28 years old, eating a gray ration pack in a maintenance corridor. I had him brought to my war chamber before the night cycle ended. I told myself it was for an interrogation. I needed to assess the selection, understand what the crown had detected that 43 prepared champions had failed to provide. I needed data. That was what I told myself. The crown had been worn by 1,100 empresses before me. It had held their memories, their logic, their failures, and their genius for 10,000 years. It was, I was beginning to suspect, significantly smarter than I was. I straightened my formal mantle. I ordered the night staff to bring the prisoner to the upper chamber. I sat down at the war table. I did not fidget. I absolutely did not fidget. The door opened 11 minutes later, and Kale Marin walked in, still wearing prisoner processing attire, and looked around my war chamber with the specific expression of a man who has walked into a room that he does not understand and has decided, on some fundamental level, that this is the room's problem and not his. He looked at the star maps covering 3 walls. He looked at the crown, resting in its case on the central table. He looked at me. "You're the one in charge," he said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "Right." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are filing information rather than agreeing. "Is there any actual food here, or is it all going to be the gray rectangles?" 10,000 years of imperial selection logic. This was what it had found. I stared at him for a moment that was 3 seconds longer than any sovereign should allow themselves. "Sit down," I said. He sat. He looked at the star maps again. His eyes moved across the border systems with the focused attention of someone who was not seeing decoration. He was reading them. I watched him read my war maps and did not say anything, and did not name what I was feeling, and told myself, very firmly, that the calculus would resolve this cleanly. It would not resolve this cleanly. I already knew that. But it was still night, and I was still the Empress, and I had until morning to pretend otherwise. He gave me exactly 6 minutes before he spoke again. Not 6 minutes of uncomfortable silence. 6 minutes of him studying the war maps with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands, moving his gaze from one border system to the next in a pattern that was not random, that had a logic to it I found myself following. "Your eastern reach," he said. "Selrath, Vorcanes, Dreveth Minor. Those 3 fall in order. Your supply line to the outer colonies collapses." I said nothing. "That's what's happening, isn't it?" He did not look at me when he said it, still reading the maps. Not 3 separate losses, one coordinated push. Somebody's playing the long move. The High Council had been arguing about the Eastern losses for 60 days. They had produced 200 pages of strategy documents, 9 competing theories, and 4 formal accusations of blame distributed among various military commanders. He had been in the room for 6 minutes. I picked up the briefing file from the table and held it out to him. He took it, he read it. Not quickly in the performative way that people read documents in front of empresses, rushing to demonstrate comprehension. He actually read it, slowly, turning pages back to check earlier figures, making a small sound once, not a word, just the sound of a mind encountering something that confirmed a suspicion. 4 minutes, he handed it back. "What do they want?" he said. "The enemy forces, what do they want?" I opened my mouth. "Not what they're taking," he said. "What do they want? There's a difference." The war chamber was very quiet. In 60 days of High Council emergency sessions, that question had not been asked once. I looked at Kale Marin, 28 years old, Firebase Yuma, scheduled for standard processing, eating a gray ration rectangle in a maintenance corridor, and felt the crown's selection logic rearrange itself in my mind into something that almost made sense. "That," I said carefully, "is an interesting question." "It's the only question," he said. He leaned back in the chair. "Everything else is tactics, that's strategy. You can't beat something you don't understand." He paused. "Also, I haven't eaten since yesterday. Is that something we could address at some point, or is the interrogation going first?" It was not an interrogation. I had a full kitchen staff on the night cycle. I did not summon them. I was the Empress. I did not fetch things. I stood up, walked to the side chamber, and brought back the tray of provisions that my personal staff left during night cycle for my own use, and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at the tray, he looked at me. "Thank you," he said. No title, no honorific, no ceremony. Just thank you. I sat back down and said nothing, and watched him eat and looked at the border systems on the war maps, and tried very hard to keep running the cold mathematics of survival. The mathematics kept returning the wrong answer. Or possibly the right one. I was no longer certain which was which, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing that had happened to me in 11 years of rule. I adjourned the rite formally the next morning. I told the High Council the crown required a secondary calibration cycle. This was not a lie, precisely. It required them to accept a result they were not prepared for, which was a form of calibration. Verk looked at me with the specific expression he reserved for moments when he believed he was about to be proven right about something. He was going to be insufferable about this. I had Kale Marin moved from prisoner processing to the Eastern Guest Wing, given clean clothes, and assigned a staff of 12. I sent a formal notification to his government that their soldier had been elevated in status under the terms of the Velketh-bound Accord. I did not tell him any of this in advance. I told myself that was because the situation required careful management. The crown, resting in its case on my war table, maintained a low, steady hum all through the rest of that night. Content apparently deeply unhelpful. The ceremonial armor had no knee articulation. I want to be precise about this because it seems like a small thing, and it was not a small thing. I have been in combat situations where the difference between a working knee joint and a ceremonial knee joint is the difference between moving and not moving in combat has a very specific and very final outcome. The armor they dressed me in for my first formal presentation as bound champion of the Velketh Empire was 40 kilograms of articulated metal that had clearly been designed by someone who believed warfare happened while standing completely still. I stood in the fitting chamber and looked at myself in the reflection surface and said, with the calm of a man who has survived worse mornings, absolutely not. The 3 attendants assigned to the armor fitting, small beings, efficient, with 4 hands each that worked with the synchronized precision of a pit crew, stopped moving and looked at me. The knee joint, I said, it doesn't bend. The senior attendant made a sound that my translation chip rendered as something between an explanation and an apology. The ceremonial armor of the bound champion had not been fitted to a living body in 400 years. The previous bound champion had been a Kreth-Savar, a species that did not have knees. Right, I said, we're going to need to fix that. They took notes, all 3 of them, with the focused urgency of people who had never considered the structural requirements of human knee joints and were now treating this information as sacred. I asked for their names. They stopped taking notes. Your names, I said again. What do I call you? The senior attendant, her name translated roughly as Ven, told me in a careful voice that attendants of the fitting chamber were not typically addressed by name by bound champions. What do they get addressed as? They are not typically addressed at all. I thought about that for a moment. Well, I said, I'm going to need something to call you when I'm asking you to fix the knee joint situation. So, Ven. She blinked, all 4 of her eyes in sequence. Yes. The knee joint. Can it be modified without destroying the ceremonial integrity of the piece? She looked at the armor. She looked at my knee. She said, with the careful precision of someone discovering a solution she should probably have been authorized to discover earlier, yes. I believe so. Great, let's do that. The other 2 attendants were named Pelin and Orath. By the time the fitting was complete, 2 hours later, all 3 of them had stopped making the expression I had initially identified as terror, and were making a different one that I did not have a name for but that felt more like the early stages of something functional. The armor still weighed 40 kilograms, but the knees worked. I counted that as progress. The war chamber I had been assigned was large enough to land a short-range transport in. The star maps on 3 walls were detailed to the point of being beautiful, the kind of careful, loving cartography that told you someone had spent serious time making sure every border system was precisely placed. I stood in front of them for a long time that first morning, working through the Eastern situation the way I had been working through every problem since Yuma. Start with what you can see, identify what you cannot see, figure out the gap between them. The gap in the Eastern situation was significant. 60 days of failed defense operations, 3 border systems lost in sequence, 200 pages of council strategy documents that I had read in the previous night and that had, I was fairly certain, been produced by people who were very smart about the wrong things. I sat down with a blank briefing sheet and wrote 4 words at the top. What do they want? I was still working through that question 3 hours later when the door to the war chamber opened, and 12 beings of various senior staff, rank filed in with the coordinated energy of people who had rehearsed an entrance. They stood in a formation. They were very formal. The senior one, a tall, silver-mantled administrator named Drevsal, which my translation chip rendered as something close to Lord of the Upper Chambers, delivered a prepared statement welcoming me to the position of bound champion and outlining my ceremonial responsibilities for the next 31 days. I listened to the whole thing. It took 17 minutes. When it was done, I said, "What are the garrison casualty numbers at the Velforth fortress?" Silence. "The border fortress," I said. "Velforth, 60-day siege. What are the current casualty numbers?" Drevsal said that military operational figures were managed by the High Council's War Committee and were not typically part of the bound champion's initial briefing cycle. "Okay," I said. "Can you get me the supply chain records for the 3 eastern garrisons? Ration allocation, ammunition resupply, rotation schedules." More silence. "Communication logs between the frontier commanders and the High Council over the past 60 days. The silence was taking on a specific texture now. Personnel roster of every soldier currently stationed at Velforth. Drevsal said, carefully, that he would need to inquire about authorization levels. "I'm the bound champion," I said. "What's my authorization level?" He told me. It was, technically, second only to the Empress. "Great," I said. "Then I'd like those files." He left to get authorization anyway. Old habits. I understood. In any system that had been running the same way for a long time, the first instinct when someone asks for something unusual is to check whether they are actually allowed to have it, even when the answer is obviously yes. I went back to the star maps. The files arrived 2 hours later, delivered by a junior aide who moved with the specific energy of someone who had been told this was unusual and was trying not to show that he found it exciting. I read through the personnel roster first. 843 soldiers at Velforth. Names, ranks, specialties, years of service. I read every name. Not quickly, not as data, I read them as people. Because they were people with the specific weight that 843 of anything has when each unit is a breathing, thinking individual who was currently inside a fortress that had been under attack for 60 days. Then I read the supply chain records. I found the problem in 14 minutes. It was not a military problem. It was an administrative error. A classification mismatch between 2 supply routing systems that had been in use simultaneously since a bureaucratic restructuring 4 years ago, which had resulted in Velforth's resupply allocation being calculated under the old system's troop count figures, while actual resupply was being processed under the new system's categories. The result was a 40% shortfall in ration allocation to 3 frontier garrisons, compounding over 8 months, creating a supply deficit that had been quietly devastating the eastern defensive capacity long before the siege began. It was not sabotage. It was not strategy. It was 2 databases that did not agree with each other and no one had checked. I wrote out the correction in clear language. The requisition form took 12 minutes to complete. The signal burst to the Supply Routing Authority took 3 minutes to transmit. I sent it. Then I went back to the question at the top of my blank briefing sheet. What do they want? I was still there 2 hours later, when the door opened and she walked in. I knew it was her before I turned around, not because I had studied her file. I had, and it was impressively sparse given how much she clearly knew, but because the room changed when she entered it. The air had a different quality, the kind of quality that rooms acquire when something with significant gravity enters them. Empress Savara Velkith. I turned around. She was standing 6 feet inside the door, in full formal attire, deep blue, layered, with the kind of precision tailoring that made the clothes look like they had been grown onto her rather than put on. Her eyes were the color of deep space phenomena, not in a poetic way but in a literal, physical way, and they were looking at me with an expression that I was fairly certain was supposed to be neutral authority. It was doing something more complicated than that. She said, "You sent a signal burst to the Supply Routing Authority." "Yes," I said. "Without authorization from the War Committee. I'm second authorization in the chain. I authorized it myself." It was a supply chain correction. It was. The ration allocation error has been running for 8 months. 3 frontier garrisons were operating at 60% provisioning capacity. It's fixed now. She looked at me. Then she looked at the stack of files on the table. Then at the star maps where I had been marking notes in grease pencil, a habit from Yuma, the only writing implement I had asked for and actually received without a diplomatic incident. "You've been here for 11 hours, she said. "Yes." "And you corrected a supply chain error that the High Council's War Committee has been managing for 8 months. The War Committee wasn't managing it. They didn't know about it, different databases. I can show you the—" "Why?" she said. I stopped. Not the why she had asked me before, what do they want, the strategic question. This was different, smaller. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read and asking why as though the answer was the thing she actually came here for. I said, "Because the people at Velforth were hungry, Savara." Something moved across her face. I had used her name, no title. I registered that a half-second after it came out, the way you register a step that lands wrong, not painful, just different from expected. Her expression didn't shift to anger. It shifted to something I didn't have a category for, something that looked like a person encountering a thing they had not prepared a response to. "That," she said, "is not a strategic justification." "No," I said, "it's a human one." She looked at me for one more moment, then turned and walked out. I stood in the war chamber after she left and looked at the star maps and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds. Then I thought about the way her face had moved when I said her name. I walked to the door, went 2 corridors down and stopped walking. I stood in the empty corridor for a while. "Sweet baby Jesus," I said to no one, "I am in so much trouble." I went back to the war maps. There was work to do. 843 people at Velforth, and a siege that wasn't going to solve itself, and a question at the top of a blank briefing sheet that I had not yet answered. I was in trouble. But Velforth needed a plan, and trouble could wait. The High Council's chamber smelled like ceremony and old disagreements. 12 high lords in their war mantles, arranged in a precise semicircle behind a raised platform that was technically called the Table of Equal Council, and was, in practice, designed to make everyone seated at it look down at the person standing below. I had seen the same design in 3 different military contexts back home. It never meant equal anything. It meant the people at the table were comfortable with the current arrangement and intended to remain so. I stood below the table with my 4-page relief plan in my hands and looked at 12 faces wearing 12 different versions of the same expression, which was the expression of beings who had already decided the outcome of this meeting and were waiting with moderate patience for the procedural portion to conclude. Savara sat at the far end of the chamber, separate from the council table, on a seat that was technically not a throne and was practically indistinguishable from one. She was wearing the formal mantle again. She looked like someone who had not slept well and was not going to admit it. I had not slept either. I had spent the night working, which was the same as sleeping for me in the way that movement is the same as rest for certain types of machinery, not technically true, but functionally sufficient. High Lord Verk spoke first. He was the one with the silver-edged mantle and the 40 years of practice condescension arranged in his posture. His opening remarks took 9 minutes. I timed it. The summary was human, small, brief, insufficient, and the existing plan, which had been failing for 60 days, was strategically superior by virtue of having been developed by beings who understood the complexities of galactic warfare. Then he sat down. I said, "Your plan has failed for 60 days. Verk said, with the tone of a being addressing a maintenance drone that had asked an impertinent question, "It has not failed. It has been in process. 843 soldiers have been under siege for 60 days, I said. 3 resupply attempts have been turned back. Casualty rate is at 11% and climbing. If that's process, I'd like to know what failure looks like from your position." The chamber went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when someone has said the true thing that no one was saying. "The bound champion will kindly recall," Verk said, "that he is new to this council." "I am," I said. "Fresh eyes, here's what fresh eyes see." I laid the plan on the table where they could see it. 4 pages. Clean. Every step numbered, every contingency branched, the logic running straight from the opening move to the probable close. "The siege works because they have controlled the 3 approach corridors," I said. "We've been trying to force the southern one for 60 days because it's the shortest route. They know that. They've built their whole defensive setup around us wanting the southern approach, so we don't take the southern approach." I pointed to the star map on the chamber wall. The eastern reach. Selrath, Vorkanes, Dreveth Minor in sequence. We come from the Dreveth side. It's longer. It requires jump coordination between 2 fleet elements that have not operated jointly before. The corridor has gravitational interference in the mid-range that makes targeting complicated. Everything about it is harder. "Then why," said one of the other High Lords, whose name my translation chip rendered as something close to Lord of the Second Reach, "would we attempt it?" "Because they're not defending it," I said. "Nobody defends the hard approach because nobody tries it. We've spent 60 days doing the expected thing. The expected thing isn't working. We do the unexpected thing." Verk leaned forward. "You are proposing that the Velkith Imperial Fleet abandon its established strategic corridor and execute a complex joint operation in gravitationally compromised space based on 4 pages written by a human who has been in this empire for 11 days. 12, I said. 12 days. "And yes," I said, "that's what I'm proposing." Verk looked at me with the calm, deliberate weight of a being who has been waiting for a moment and has now arrived at it. "Then I invoke the right of formal challenge," he said. "Under the charter of imperial appointment, the bound champion's authority is not established until tested before this council. If the champion refuses the challenge, his appointment is void." The chamber was very still. I looked at Verk. He was large by alien standards, not the largest in the room, but built with the particular density of someone who had spent decades understanding that physical presence was a form of argument. The challenge was lethal by traditional terms. He knew that. He was counting on me knowing that too. I looked at the star map. 843 names. "Accepted," I said. Savara moved. Not much, a shift of weight, a slight forward motion, the body language of a person about to say something. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Verk. She stopped moving. The challenge space cleared in the center of the chamber. Verk descended from the table platform, shedding his war mantle to reveal the combat form beneath, broad, armored in natural plate that his species grew over a lifetime. He was formidable. He knew it. He carried his knowledge of it the way some beings carry weapons. He came at me directly. No opening ceremony, no ritual circling. He had assessed me as the smaller opponent and decided that directness was the logical play. He was right that I was smaller. He was wrong that this was the relevant variable. Yuma had not produced many things I was grateful for. It had produced one, the specific knowledge of how larger opponents move when they are certain they are going to win. They commit too early. They put too much weight in the forward motion because they expect the smaller opponent to move backward, and the whole architecture of their attack is built on that expected retreat. I moved sideways. He corrected. Faster than I expected. I will give Verk that he was fast for his size. But the correction put his weight distributed wrong for a half step, and a half step is enough. It was not a long fight. He was on the floor of the chamber, not injured in any lasting way, but down, and the logic of the challenge was satisfied. I stepped back. The chamber was quiet. I looked at the star map on the wall, then at the 12 high lords at the table, then at Verk, getting slowly to his feet with the careful dignity of a being who intends to carry this moment without showing what it cost him. The plan is 4 pages, I said. I'm open to questions about any of it, but we need to move in the next 48 hours or the gravitational window on the Drevath approach closes for 30 days. I looked at Sivara. She was looking at me with the expression I still did not have a name for. The same one from the war chamber from the night before, from the moment I had said her name without a title and watched something move across her face that she had not authorized. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked at the High Council. Begin the operational planning, she said. The bound champions approach, full fleet authorization. Verk said nothing. Nobody said anything. The fleet began moving within 6 hours. Velforth was relieved in 41 hours and 23 minutes. The Drevath approach worked exactly as the plan described, for exactly the reasons I had explained to 12 faces wearing 12 versions of politely concealed doubt. The enemy force had not defended the gravitational corridor. They had not expected anyone to try it. When 2 Velkoth fleet elements coordinated through the interference and emerged on the undefended eastern approach, the siege broke in 11 minutes. I received the confirmation signal in the war chamber. I was eating actual food this time, something the kitchen staff had figured out I could tolerate, a warm dish with protein content that was not shaped like a gray rectangle. I read the confirmation. I set it down. I finished eating. Sivara appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment. She was still in full formal attire. She had been in meetings and briefings since the fleet moved. She looked like a person who had been carrying empire weight without setting it down and had not yet found a surface to set it on. It worked, she said. Yes. You knew it would. I thought it would, I said. There's a difference. I thought the logic was sound. Combat doesn't always follow logic. She looked at me. This one did, she said. This one did, I agreed. She did not move from the doorway. I did not say anything. The star maps were on the wall behind me, the border systems bright and detailed in the chamber's light, and somewhere among them Velforth was open again, provisioned, its 843 names intact. You should sleep, I said. When did you last sleep? She blinked. Whatever she had prepared to say, it was not a response to that question. I sleep when the Empire allows it, she said. The Empire can manage 6 hours, I said. The Drevath window is closed. The Council is in shock. Nobody is going to do anything dramatic before morning. Sleep. She looked at me with the weight of 11 years of imperial rule, arranged behind her eyes. You are very strange, she said. Yes, I said, sleep anyway. She left. I sat with the star maps for a long time after. The soldiers who had given me their information about Velforth, the ones who had been there, who knew the terrain, who had told me things that did not appear in any official briefing document, had names now in my memory alongside the 843 on the roster. That was how this worked. You learned the names, you fixed the thing you could reach, then the next thing, then the next. The empire was large. There were many things to reach. I was not thinking about Savara standing in the doorway, and the thing on her face that I kept misreading as one emotion when it was probably another one. I was absolutely not thinking about that. I went back to the star maps and found 6 more things to fix. On the 14th day, a garrison cook named Pelvar sent me a message through the internal staff communication system. Not an official communication, not a briefing or a request or a complaint filed through the proper channels. A personal message, in the informal register, which my translation chip told me was roughly equivalent to a note passed between people who were not supposed to be passing notes. It said the ration correction reached us, we noticed. We did not think anyone would notice, thank you. I read it 3 times. Then I wrote back, what else needs fixing? His reply came 4 hours later and was 7 paragraphs long. That was how the next phase began, not with any plan, not with a strategy document or a formal proposal or an authorized restructuring initiative. It began with a cook named Pelvar who had a list of things that were broken and had found, for the first time in his career, someone who would read it. I read it, I wrote things down, I started asking. You would be surprised, or maybe you would not, how much a military operation can improve when someone simply asks the people doing the work what does not work. Not their commanders, not the administrative layer, the people whose hands are in the actual machinery of the thing. I spent 3 days in the lower barracks, the maintenance levels, the medical wards, the logistics corridors. I talked to soldiers on rotation, supply handlers, communications technicians, the beings who maintained the jump gate infrastructure that connected the outer colonies to the imperial center. I asked each of them the same question. What is broken that no one has fixed? The answers were not dramatic. They were not the grand strategic failures that fill history records. They were small, accumulated, patient failures. The kind that build over years when a system gets large enough that the people at the top can no longer see the bottom. A redundant authorization requirement that added 11 days to emergency resupply requests. A translation error in the medical intake system that had been misclassifying a specific category of combat injury for 3 years. A rotation schedule for border patrol units that did not account for the gravitational time variance on certain outreach assignments, resulting in soldiers reporting for duty having effectively lost 2 days of biological rest without anyone's records reflecting it. None of these were political. None of them required council authorization. None of them were in any briefing document I had been given. All of them were fixable. I fixed them one at a time, using the authorization level I had been assigned as bound champion, using requisition forms and signal bursts, and in 2 cases simply walking into the relevant administrative office and asking the person seated there to change the thing that needed changing. The Empire did not notice. Not at first. Changes at that scale move quietly, spreading through systems the way water spreads through dry ground, filling spaces that had been empty long enough that no one remembered they were supposed to be full. But people noticed. Pelvar sent more messages. Others did too, once the word moved through the informal communication channels that something was different, that there was someone with authorization who would actually read a list of broken things and then fix them. On the 19th day, Ven came to tell me that the soldiers in the eastern garrison had started using a word for me. What word? I said. She told me. My translation chip worked on it for a moment. It came back as something that sat between the one who listened and the one who noticed, the Velkoth language apparently not distinguishing precisely between those 2 actions, treating them as aspects of the same fundamental behavior. That's a good word, I said. It is an unusual word, Ven said. It has not been applied to a bound champion before. Has it been applied to anyone? She thought about it. A physician, she said, in the Western colonies 60 years ago. I went back to my list of broken things. On the 22nd day, Savara summoned me to the upper chamber. Not the war chamber. The formal reception hall, a room I had been in once, for a ceremony in the first week, and had not been invited to since. It was tall and cold and designed to make the person standing in the center of it feel the full architectural weight of the empire looking down. She was standing at the upper end of the room when I arrived. Formal attire, full official presentation. The High Council was arrayed behind her, not at their table but standing, which I had learned was the formal configuration for a proceeding with consequences. Verk was there. His face was arranged with the careful blankness of someone who has been practicing an expression. I walked to the center of the room and stopped. Savara said, "The bound champion has been conducting an unauthorized restructuring of imperial operational systems." I said, "I've been fixing things that were broken. Without council approval. Within my authorization level." "The authorization level of the bound champion," Verk said from behind her, "does not extend to restructuring imperial." "I did not restructure anything," I said. "I fixed a redundant form requirement, corrected a 3-year translation error in the medical intake system, and adjusted a rotation schedule that was costing soldiers biological rest days. Those are corrections, not restructuring." "The effect is structural," Verk said. "The effect is that things work better," I said. "I understand that's unusual." Verk's expression did not change. The bound champion is operating outside the boundaries of his position. "The bound champion," I said, "has been doing the job he was chosen for." Savara said nothing. That was the thing I had been trying not to notice for 22 days, the specific quality of her silence. It was not passive. It was not the silence of a person who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a person who was processing, constantly, running calculations behind eyes that gave away exactly as much as she decided to give away, and not one fraction more. She was giving away more than she intended right now. I could see it in the way she held the formal mantle, not easily, the way a person holds something that has been too heavy for too long. "The council moves," Verk said, "to suspend the bound champion's operational authorization pending formal review." I looked at Savara. She looked at me. 17 pages, cross-referenced, with proposed solutions. I had prepared them after she had summoned me, because I had known this meeting was coming and I knew what she would need when it did. I placed them on the table between us. "Everything I've done," I said, "every correction, every change, the reasoning, the authorization basis, the before and after figures. Pelvar at the Eastern Garrison sent me his casualty projection numbers from before the ration fix and after. They're in there." She did not touch the pages. She looked at them, then she looked at me. "You made them hungry," Verk said. He meant the outer territories. The implication being that my changes had disrupted the existing order. That order, even imperfect order, had a stability that disruption threatened. "They were already hungry," I said. "I just made sure someone knew." The room was very quiet. Savara looked at the 17 pages, then at the High Council behind her, then back at me. "Why?" she said. "Same word as before, different weight." I looked at her, really looked at her, the way I had been not looking at her for 22 days because looking made the mathematics complicated, and said, "Because they were hungry, Savara." And there it was again, the thing that moved across her face when I used her name. The thing I had been telling myself was unreadable, was ambiguous, was probably an emotion in a register I did not have the cultural framework to interpret. It was not unreadable. I looked away. "The 17 pages are self-explanatory," I said. If the council wants to review them formally, I'm available for that process. But the Eastern Garrison has a 30-day resupply window opening in 6 days, and the new rotation schedule needs to be confirmed before then. So if the formal review could happen before that. The review, Savara said, will not be necessary. Verk said, Empress. The bound champion's actions are within his charter, she said. The 17 pages confirm this. The review is unnecessary. She picked up the pages from the table. She did not look at Verk when she said it. She did not look at me either. She looked at the pages like they contained a question. She had been trying to answer for 22 days. Continue, she said. I walked out of the formal hall. 2 corridors, I stopped. I stood in the empty corridor and thought about the weight in her voice when she said continue, and the way she held the 17 pages, and the specific mathematics of a person carrying something too heavy who has just been offered a surface to share the load on, and is not yet sure whether to trust it. Not my circus, I thought. Completely my circus. I kept walking. The next morning I got 12 more messages from people who had broken things, and a list from Pelvar that was, this time, 9 paragraphs long. I started at the top. The vote was 17-1. 17 High Lords, 1 against. The motion: dissolve the bound champion arrangement under the Emergency Stability Clause of the Imperial Charter, citing destabilization of established operational structures through unauthorized intervention. They used the word unauthorized 7 times in the formal reading of the motion. I counted. I was not in the chamber when the vote happened. I was in the lower communications bay, working through a signal routing inefficiency that had been adding 6-hour delays to emergency transmissions from the outer colonies. When Ven came to find me with her 4 hands doing the particular thing they did when she was carrying news, she was not certain how to deliver. The council voted, she said. I know, I said, 17-1. She stopped. You knew. I knew it was coming. I've been in enough command structures to know when the institution is moving against a variable it hasn't figured out how to categorize yet. They were going to move. The only question was timing. She looked at me with all 4 eyes. What will you do? I looked at the signal routing array. The inefficiency was in the 3rd relay junction. 42 minutes to correct. After that, outer colony emergency transmissions would route in real time instead of with a 6-hour delay. That was roughly 800,000 people who would be able to reach Imperial emergency services in the time it actually took to reach them. Finish this, I said, then I'll figure out the next thing. The next thing came to me before I finished the relay junction. The chamber door opened, and Savara walked in alone. Not with attendants, not in full formal attire. In the practical version of the imperial mantle, the one she wore in the war chamber, the one that moved rather than declared. She walked to where I was working and stood beside me and looked at the signal routing array. She said nothing for a moment. I kept working. They voted, she said. Yes. 17-1. Who was the one? I said. She said nothing. I looked at her. She held my gaze with the specific steadiness of a person who has made a decision and is not retreating from it. You voted against, I said. I do not vote, she said. I rule. The vote does not require my participation. My participation would have been, however. A signal, I said. Yes. I looked at the relay junction. 30 minutes left on the correction. What happens now? I have exercised the sovereign override, she said. It has been used twice in 10,000 years of Velkith history. The override dissolves a council motion and replaces it with sovereign directive. I set down the calibration tool. You dissolved the vote. I dissolved the council, she said. I turned to look at her fully. She was watching me with an expression that was not quite the one from the war chamber, not quite the one from the formal hall, Not quite any of the ones I had been trying to catalog for 37 days. It was something new. It looked like a person standing on the other side of a decision they cannot unmake, checking whether the ground is solid. The whole council, I said. The charter allows for full dissolution in cases of institutional obstruction to sovereign operational necessity, she said. I cited 3 specific clauses. I wrote the citations myself, last night. You were up last night writing charter citations. I was preparing. I looked at the star maps on the wall of the communications bay. Smaller versions, less detailed than the war chamber, but the same reach. The same border systems, the same outer territories, the same 42 billion lives arranged across 6 systems in the dark. The High Lords will fight it, I said. Some will, yes. You'll have to manage that politically for months. Longer, probably. That is a significant amount of work, I said, to keep one human fixing signal routing inefficiencies in the lower communications bay. She looked at me. Something moved at the corner of her expression, not quite the thing I kept misidentifying, not quite anything I had seen before. Something quieter. You have not been fixing inefficiencies, she said. You have been finding the places where people were invisible and making them visible. That is not a small thing, Kale. First time she used my name. No title, no formal designation. Just my name in the same register I had been using hers. I looked at the relay junction, 28 minutes. I need to finish this, I said. The outer colonies need the signal correction before anything else. I know, she said. She did not leave. She pulled a second work stool from the equipment shelf and sat down beside me, still in her practical mantle, and looked at the relay junction with the focused attention she brought to everything. Show me, she said. The routing inefficiency. All of it, she said. Show me how you see it. I picked up the calibration tool. I showed her. For 26 minutes, while the correction ran, I explained the relay logic, the 3 junctions, the delay pattern, the simple fix that had not been made because no one in the communications bay had authorization above the 3rd administrative tier, and no one with higher authorization had ever walked into the communications bay to ask what was wrong. She listened the way she read briefing files, actively, following the logic, asking one precise question at the junction I had not explained clearly enough, and not asking questions where she had understood. The correction completed. The signal routing array shifted from the delayed pattern to real time. A small light on the junction panel moved from yellow to green. 800,000 people. She looked at the green light. What is next? She said. I pulled out the list. It was long. I had stopped trying to count how many items were on it. She looked at the list, then at me. We will need a new administrative structure, she said, for the council dissolution. The institutional framework requires 12 people, I said, not 12 high lords, 12 people who know the systems from the inside, the ones who have been sending me messages, Pelvar for logistics, the physician from the Western colonies, she's been sending notes about the medical intake system for 3 years, the communications engineer who flagged the routing problem to me in the first place. She considered this. They are not political appointments, she said. No, I said, they know what's broken. She was quiet for a moment. That is not how imperial administration has been structured. I know, I said. It would be significantly more effective. I know, I said. She looked at the list, then she looked at the star maps on the wall. I watched her. I had watched her for 37 days in the war chamber, in the formal hall, across the table in the communication bay, across the silence of corridors at the end of long days when neither of us had figured out how to say what the room was full of. I had been misreading things on purpose, calling them something smaller than they were because smaller was manageable, and the actual size of the thing was not. She reached out and touched the edge of the star map where the eastern border systems ran. Selrath, Vorcanes, Dreveth Minor. Her fingers moved across them the way people touch things they care about, with the weight of knowing them, not just seeing them. My mother ruled this empire for 40 years, she said. She told me once that the hardest thing about ruling was not the enemies outside the border. It was the distance. The way the empire grows large enough that the people running it cannot hear the people inside it. She did not say anything else. I looked at her hand on the star map. You heard them, she said. From the first week. You walked into the barracks and asked names and wrote things down, and they told you everything because no one had ever asked. I just asked, I said. That is the thing you do not understand yet, she said. That is not small. The communications bay was quiet. The relay junction green light held steady. The outer colonies were receiving transmissions in real time for the first time in 3 years, and no one had yet been formally notified of this change. And somewhere in the eastern garrison, a cook named Pelvar was probably adding to a list that was now 11 paragraphs long. I was sitting next to the Empress of the Velkith Empire in a lower communications bay at the 3rd hour of the night cycle, with a calibration tool in my hand, and a list of broken things on the table between us. I should have said something. I did not say anything. She did not say anything either. The star maps held the weight of 42 billion lives in the dark, and the empire outside the door was shifting shape around the changes that had already been made and the changes that were coming. And neither of us was looking at the other, but both of us were aware, with the specific awareness of two people in a small room who have run out of ways to pretend the room is not small, that the next thing to say was not on any list. She stood up. She straightened the practical mantle. She picked up the list of broken things and looked at it for a moment, not reading it, holding it, like it meant something beyond its content. I will be in the war chamber at first light, she said, for the restructuring discussion. I'll be there, I said. She moved toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She did not turn around. She stood with her back to me and the door in front of her and the weight of a dissolved council and a charter override and 37 days of careful calculation behind her, and said one word. Kale. Not a question, not an order, just my name in the quiet of the communications bay, like she was checking whether it was real. I said Sivara. She stood there for one more moment. Then she walked out. I sat in the communications bay for a long time after. The green light on the relay junction was steady and calm. The list of broken things was on the table. The star maps held the border systems in their careful detail. I picked up the list. 11 paragraphs. I started at the top. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. But something had changed in the shape of the room after she left. The way rooms change when something significant has entered them and is not quite gone yet, and I was aware of it in the specific way that I had been aware of Firebase Yuma on the last morning. The particular quality of a moment that is not over even though it looks, from the outside, like it is over. It was not over. I went back to the list, and I worked. And outside in the dark of the empire, the changes were moving quietly through systems that had needed them for years, filling empty spaces the way water fills dry ground, and the green light on the relay junction held steady, and 42 billion lives were a little less invisible than they had been the day before. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow there would be a war chamber and a restructuring discussion, and 12 people who knew what was broken. And an empress who had learned to say my name without a title. That was enough. That was, in fact, considerably more than enough. I finished the list. I started a new one.